Right, hello everybody. Welcome back. Sorry about the delay in getting things put out there. I've been a little busy in my personal life, been moving myself into a studio treatment room. Maybe chat about that in a little bit, but it's meant that I haven't had as much time for getting these videos up. So, podcast today. I know that's not everybody's favorite one, but it was overdue, so I'm on it now. And from next week, I'm gonna get back on having some Cuban videos, tips, strategies, stuff about your brain, stuff about your body that you can use to help you get better. So if you're watching this is from the Irish Championships that happened early on in August. This is attempt number 1. And my whole thoughts after this competition were just, I feel super old and washed up and just like I'm on a downward decline. So today we're going to talk a bit about aging, basically, how different ages have certain pitfalls that we need to watch out for if we want to continue to perform at our best. We'll go from kids, super young, since that's how a lot of people get into cubing, and then we'll get up to my level and beyond. What kind of things tend to hold people back at different ages? What kind of things do people struggle with, whether it's in reality or in their mental state, that stops them achieving what their actual potential is. So for everybody, it's undisputable that things are going to decline as you age. But I actually think that what is a realistic state of decline versus the state of decline that we see in a lot of people don't really match up. So most people don't do so well as they get older, and they assume that that's just them getting older, but in reality they're just placing a lot of mental blocks in place. And I think I've been pretty lucky. I've kind of avoided this more than other people. When I go to speak to other high performers, other athletes in my kind of age group, most of them kind of are getting to that point now where they're just like, oh, well, I guess this is sort of over for me. I can start letting go of this and moving on to something else, and that's kind of fine. That's what you should expect with life. Nobody sticks with one thing forever. But I think there's a problem with the language where if you are saying that you getting old is the excuse for why you're moving on, I don't think that's particularly healthy. If you just want to give it up because you want to move on to another stage of your life, then just say that. Like, say, yeah, actually, I did this for decades, and now I want to do something else, and I want to enjoy the process of being older and all the things that brings. That's totally fine, but just don't claim that it is coming from like an age-related thing. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling a little bit. I'm going to try and be as concise as possible in this episode because I know I tend to go off on tangents. Let's kind of talk about what holds people back, and to do that, we're going to need to start way back at the beginning. So we'll have to start for when you're a child and you're starting to perform at a high level. What are the kind of age-related pitfalls that you need to watch out for? So for some of this, there might be overlap of the things that I said when I was speaking about worlds. Can't remember when that was, a couple of episodes ago, but I kind of talked about the idea that the younger you are when you get into things like speed cubing, while you have loads of benefits in terms of how your brain will adapt to learning new things, as well as just the actual time factor. Like if you've got more time than somebody else to learn a whole list of rote memorization things like algorithms, that is going to serve you pretty well in the long term. There can also be quite a lot of psychological drawbacks too, because our brains were kind of designed to adapt to moving and adapt to learning in a specific way. And every time we start high achieving in certain areas, we tend to kind of like fast forward this process. And so instead of learning to, just have fun with something, then learning to enjoy watching your skills grow, like enjoy the process of just naturally getting better, then enjoy the process of actively trying to get better, like trying to work out where your weaknesses are, then bringing that into like the realm of competition where you actually prove under certain conditions that you're a certain level of ability, trying to then better yourself, and finally trying to better other people. If you get really, really good at something really, really fast, then you kind of jump through most of that, if not very, very fast, and maybe sometimes even not at all. There might be certain stages that you just leave out. You might discover, hey, I'm really good at speed cubing, and suddenly people go, okay, well, go compete against these guys, and you're suddenly comparing yourself to other people at a very early stage that really isn't necessarily too healthy. Like, while you're still winning, it's probably not going to do you too much damage. But the moment that things start to go wrong, somebody who's shortcutted that whole process is going to find that as much more immensely painful because they haven't solidified all the learning concepts that somebody else might have. So, they haven't had to deal with how to process failure in all of those other areas. And when you process failure in the sense that I'm just not good enough compared to somebody else, that can be pretty painful if you haven't spent that whole process of like developing your own self-confidence and self-esteem by proving to yourself that even when you fail, you're able to, get back on top of things and revisit stuff, and that it's not the end of the world. So that's kind of one of the things. I won't speak too much about that this time around because I kind of talked about it in the Worlds video. Now, like I think I said in the Worlds video, this is just like the general kind of theory as well. So somebody like Yiheng coming second by a very close margin in the previous world championships, and then to go on and win it next time around, it's definitely showing that maybe he is kind of an exception when it comes to some of these things. But then it's also really, really hard to say over time because we don't know how things are going to adapt as he gets older, and that's the same for pretty much every cuber that was really, really good as a kid. There's going to be a lot of obstacles that you're going to come up against when you get older that people don't often consider. So on top of this, one of the big kind of killers of child prodigies especially is just time itself. So there's a kind of idea that if you get really, really good really, really fast, your brain has to hyper focus on the specific skills, the exact skills, sorry, that were required in order to achieve that goal. So somebody who learns a skill over a much longer period of time gets to play with that skill a lot more and experience many different iterations and variations of that skill. Not sure if that makes sense. I'll try and explain it a bit further. So, like, if you're playing football and somebody tells you the exact part of your foot that you should hit the ball, kick the ball with in order to, take it, let's say, take a penalty. and they say that you need to hit the ball in this exact spot and you need to run with this exact number of steps. If they're really methodical and saying this is the perfect kind of strategy to do this, then your brain is going to associate taking a penalty as only being allowed to be those kinds of things. And a penalty kick is pretty rigid in terms of structure, but then if you zoom out of that and apply it to the entire game of football, if everything that you're teaching somebody is based around this is the exact right way to do this thing, then their brain is going to learn from a very early age that there is no room for variation. If you want to teach somebody really, really quickly, that is the best way to do it, is to teach the brain that this never changes. These are non-negotiable attributes of this sport or skill. So you better just learn them exactly as they are and never deviate from this path. If I learn football over a much longer period of time, then I actually have room to play with all of the different ways that I could kick the ball. And my brain can start to learn how to calculate and readjust. So, if I kick with a certain part of my foot, then depending on where I hit the ball, I start to learn what happens to the ball. And if I manage to miss that part of my foot and I kick with a different part of my foot, if it contacts the ball another type of way, then I learn all the different things that happen there. And so this person, when they've learned the skill through lots and lots of variation, they're able to troubleshoot really well later on down the line. And that becomes really, really important when strategies kind of change. So to relay that back to cubing, cubing is probably less intense when it comes to like the variation within the sport. When I was working with footballers, I got to do a little bit of work with Chelsea Football Club, and one of their youth coaches said one of the worst things to do to a young player is to teach them the current techniques and strategies of the sport, because the only thing that you can guarantee when they get to be an adult and they're hoping to go to a professional team, those skills and techniques and strategies are already going to be outdated. So if you teach them in that like rigid way, then you set them up automatically for failure, because there's going to be new techniques, new strategies, and because it's a kind of team sport and you're facing an opponent, those strategies are evolving very, very fast, and you have to constantly adapt to new things. Now, speed cubing doesn't adapt really as quickly as football will, but it does still adapt. So, when I was learning to solve a Rubik's Cube, the consensus was, choosing one cross side was absolutely the best strategy. And then within a couple of years, everybody said, actually, no, we think color neutral is a better strategy because you can find better cross solutions on inspection, and then that gives you a head start into the solve. So anyone who was starting out and learning color neutral actually had a bit of an advantage. And now it almost seems like it's coming around back full circle, where people talk about just that dual neutrality, and that might now be the best solution. And that's just kind of for the cross side of things. Things like Roux, when people were saying Roux is going to be really useful for one-handed, anyone who is just starting out now has the option to just start out only learning that technique, whereas somebody who, like myself actually, I find it really, really difficult to interact with a method like Roux, because I'm so used to looking for F2L pairs and inserting them like F2L pairs that it just doesn't come very intuitively to me. So somebody who got to learn that from the very beginning is at an advantage. But then again, later on down the line, if it doesn't seem like Roux can be as fast as, let's say, somebody using ZB method for one-handed, then these people are now at a disadvantage. So anyone who learns rigid strategies from day one is usually at a disadvantage later on down the line. And because of basically how younger kids' brains work, they tend to absorb things more rigidly if it gets presented to them in a rigid manner early on. So one of the better things to do is actually teach people through variation. So all that is to say, it becomes really interesting to watch how people who do really well when they're younger adapt to cubing later on as they get through their kind of teenage and adult years, because just because they're on a roll from the very beginning, it definitely doesn't mean that that is going to continue. And that actually takes quite a monumental amount of conscious and psychological effort to make sure that you don't run into the pitfall of just thinking that, you were just naturally gifted and you've hit a bump in the road and now it's time to knock it on the head. So while there are definitely massive advantages to learning things from a young age, there are also pitfalls that we run into that I think we should be considering. So those are kind of the big ones when it comes to kids. You can let me know if there's any ones that you think that I've left out, but generally young children like before puberty, those are the big ones that come to mind. Then I guess next we'll move on to the teenage years, and this one is where I find it gets way more interesting because as a teenager, your brain is really not very hardwired that much for physical skill. And there's a couple of good reasons for this. So, number one is just the fact that you're going through so many different growth spurts and hormonal changes that your brain actually needs time to rework out or rediscover how to coordinate and move your body. So, what we usually find with teenagers is number one, anyone who comes into their teenage years being really, really good at a skill, if they start to put a lot of pressure on themselves to perform really well, a lot of the time that can just go out the window because they have an expectation of how good they should be. And because of all these growth spurts, you've got bones growing at like alarming rates, which means that all the muscles now have to contract and stretch to different proportions in order to make the same movements that they used to be able to do. And this is pretty difficult. So generally for a lot of teenagers, they go through phases of feeling like they're super clumsy and that things just aren't working as well as they used to. And because of this is where we see like a lot of people drop out of things because they just feel like they're getting worse. And it's not that they're getting worse, they actually still retain all of the physical knowledge and all of the technical knowledge, but in practice, it's just taking a little bit of recalibration and reprocessing. So usually for that, if you can continue to make things fun in some way, or if you can find a way to ease off the pressure, and to go back to football, when I was doing the work with Chelsea, they said that they would make their players sign contracts that said that they couldn't be fired or like couldn't be dropped from the team between certain ages, and that was just their way of making sure that they weren't adding additional levels of stress. So, if you're in this high level prestigious club, it feels pretty good. The thought that you're going to get kicked out of that club feels pretty massively stressful. And if your body's already going through a lot of stress because you're trying to push it to accomplish the things that you used to be able to do, and that you're struggling with right now, that's just going to be amplified. So they said, hey, look, we're going to take away all this stress. We cannot get rid of you until you're 16 or 18. We'll sign a new contract then, and that's when we're going to want to start seeing certain types of results. And they said that that was working really pretty well for them. So that's something to bear in mind for viewers. I imagine there's not very many teenagers listening to this, but if you're a parent and you want to encourage like healthy activity and healthy sports, it's worth bearing in mind that physically things do tend to get worse. It's usually not as big an issue with the hands as it is with like bigger bones and joints like the legs specifically, but it is still something that people encounter. It's not just that the hands are different lengths, the arms are different lengths, your neck and even like the anatomy of like your eyes, your head and stuff slightly change, and this can have a pretty detrimental effect all around. So then from here, the second thing when it comes to teenagers and kind of pitfalls that they might encounter is this sort of double-edged sword where we need to look at what is going on in the frontal lobe of the brain. So this is something you may be familiar with when people say like, oh, your frontal lobes are not fully developed till you're 25. So that means that you really struggle with making sensible decisions, and it makes you super risk averse and things like that. That's actually quite a watered down version of what's going on in the frontal lobe of a teenage brain. Basically, what is happening there is something called pruning, which is basically where the brain rewires connections between brain cells at a really, really fast pace. So for all humans, we're able to rewire connections between any part of our brain. There's never an age where we're too old for it. But in teenagers, especially in the frontal lobe of the brain, we see this happen way faster than anywhere else. The other thing that's interesting to note when people are saying like, oh, your frontal lobe is not fully developed, and so this explains all of these, stupid behaviors that's kind of what it sounds like when you're talking about risk taking and poor decisions, poor judgment, all of that. It's worth noting that in terms of brain cells and brain connections, you don't actually start with less, you actually start with more. So when you're born is when you have the most connections between brain cells than any other time. And while you would think that this is really advantageous, and so surely then we just get stupider as we get older, that's not actually the case. So we start off with a finite number of brain cells. A lot of our brain cells we don't regenerate, some of them we can. And then we have trillions of connections between those brain cells. And what those trillions of connections are for basically embracing possibility. When you have the ability to connect any two brain cells together, you have the potential to adapt to any number of crazy situations. But with that potential comes the expense of time. Because if you can do absolutely anything, every single time you're encountering a problem, the brain has to make a decision about which route is it going to take. Is it going to follow route A to B to C, or is it going to follow A to C to F to B? The pathways that it takes will start making more sense as you go through more life experiences and as you start noticing which way is the most efficient way to make X event happen or Y event happen. Then your brain will start favoring certain pathways over others, and then those unused pathways are going to start to break down. So what's going on in pruning then is actually the teenager's brain is trying to cut down any excess pathways really, really quickly so it becomes much more efficient much more quickly. And what that means is it needs to test out lots of different pathways really, really quickly. So when it comes to that, like risk-seeking behavior and like poor judgment and decision making, that's kind of just the brain going, look, I need to try this one, I need to try this one, I need to try this one, I need to find out what doesn't work really, really quickly so I can figure out what to get rid of. Because once I go into my adult life, it's more important that I'm able to stand up on my own independently, and uh, I don't want to be making all these poor decisions and making all these errors much further on down the line. So that's basically a little explanation of what's happening there. The other thing that's interesting to note, and this is where we'll bring it back to cubing, is that the frontal lobe of the brain is the part that deals a whole lot with emotional regulation, with a lot of aspects of social interaction, and it also helps to give us our own sense of identity. So when you are a teenager, the skills and activities that you're really into, you're going to associate your identity with that a lot more strongly. Okay, so for a speed tuber, saying I'm a speed tuber, that means a whole lot more to somebody whose teenage brain is developing and fostering that than to somebody who's picked it up as an adult, you know. And there's good reasons for that. If a teenager is saying I'm a speed cuber, it's probably the main hobby and activity that they do. You know, they might have one or two other things that they're really into, but they will likely use one frame of reference to help determine like their personality traits and help determine how they socially interact with people. And partly that's just because it's easier to bounce ideas off one thing. So, you know, do I want to go to a party and drink alcohol? If you're identifying as, you know, a rock musician or a rock star, the answer might be more likely yes than if you're identifying as an athlete. If you identify as both of those, it becomes quite difficult, and your brain deals with a lot of like internal conflicts. So usually it likes to focus on one of them over the other. So if you combine all those things together, one, you come up with a very strong sense of motivation for training. So this is one of the reasons why teenagers especially can do really, really well when it comes to new skills, especially stuff like speed cubing, because they don't have such a high physical bar to pass. And while they're building like a sense of identity and a sense of like social interactions and stuff like that, that just serves to give you like a really high amount of motivation for learning a specific thing. So teenagers usually learn skills really well, not because their brain's interested in the skills, but they're interested in that sense of identity. So if I'm a speed tuber, I should know all of the OLL algorithms. So I'm just going to spend like 3 weeks straight making sure that I can do all of them. If I'm a speed tuber, I'm going to learn all the language associated with it. I'm going to make sure that I try to get as fast as I possibly can. And that gives you tons of motivation, which then leads to better learning. On the flip side, when you combine it with that like risk-taking side of things, the emotional regulation side of things, what you'll normally find from teenagers is that you get much more of that kind of YOLO attitude, which is go hard or go home. When I'm entering, you know, multi-blinds, you usually see a lot of the younger competitors. It's like, oh, how many are you doing? And it's like some crazy huge amount. Or it's usually, what's the national record? I'm going to do one more than that. I'm going to make sure, like, I've got nothing to lose here. If it goes well, then I climb myself socially to the kind of top rank in this place. And if it doesn't go well, I'm no further or lower in the kind of social hierarchy than I was already. So you kind of get a lot of that type of behavior. Too many failures at this point in time, or too many losses, usually leads to like conflict and pain in the brain. So for teenagers, that's the big thing to kind of watch out for, is the fact that, you know, your brain tells you the logical thing is to go for broke, but it also hasn't necessarily considered the ramifications of doing that. And sometimes having a painful loss can be enough to make you kind of want to throw in the towel, just give it all up and move on to something else. So don't think there's too much else I can say with teenagers. So I guess we'll jump it up to adults now. And I guess for adults, we'll split it into two categories. So we'd call younger adults, kind of 20s, maybe early 30s. And then since the cubing world seems to call seniors 40 plus, we'll call them seniors for now. Um, so these younger adults, so we'll just call these the new adult category. Not as much complexity when it comes to like, do I feel like, am I getting old? Am I getting kind of washed up in a sport? Usually the big thing that comes up is energy. So from being a kid all the way through to, your end of school or maybe even university years, your life tends to follow a pretty similar type of structure. And within that, there's always kind of caregivers and supervisors and people who are taking on a lot of the load and burden of like your habits, your decisions, and everything that's going on in your life. And the moment you kind of jump out into the real world, you suddenly need a lot of extra resources because suddenly a lot of these things that you were taking for granted are kind of just piled on top of you. And so my experience when I'm working with athletes, if they're I've heard more often a teenager say, "I feel like I'm too old for this," and not meaning it as like I've grown out of it, but like that I've got too old and I'm now washed up. I've heard more teenagers and maybe up to like 21 say that than I have people in their 20s. And actually, what I more often hear when it's people in their 20s and 30s, so these newer adults, it's always down to never like I'm washed up. It's more like I want to do this, but I just can't. I don't have the energy. I don't have the time. I don't have the money. And everything is reframed in terms of all these resources that this person doesn't have. And, if you've gone through the other side of being through your 20s and 30s, you'll usually agree that it was never that you didn't have the resources, it's just you didn't know how to use them, you didn't know how to organize them. That's pretty much what's happening when people just say, okay, here's real life, go. You're not going to be organizing your time, you're not going to be organizing your finances, you're not going to be doing any of that very efficiently. And I think for the majority of people, they're not really taught very well how to deal with and manage those things in school. And very often, at least with the people that I've worked with, their parents aren't necessarily helping them through that either. So in this kind of period, the whole crux of everything is just like, yeah, I don't have any problem with my abilities. I know that I would be even better if I could just put the time into it. I don't feel like my body's failing me. Whereas, most other for teenagers and the seniors, they're usually like, oh yeah, my body's not working the way it should be. The adults usually like, yeah, no, body's fine. Technically, it all should be working, and I'm just lacking resources, and this is totally draining me down. And that has been true for so many different groups of people that I've looked at that you wouldn't necessarily think. So it's true whether you're in kind of long-term education versus having a job versus unemployed. It's true regardless of kind of mental state as well. So I find people with uh, dealing with like depressive states more often versus people dealing with um, just like high levels of motivation still are struggling with the same thing. They might be producing different levels of output, like they might be getting through it better if they're less depressed and less upset and less pessimistic about the world, but they're still citing that as like their top reason why, their results or their progress is slowing down. All right, and so that brings us on to the final category. So that is the seniors. So this is kind of anywhere from 30s onwards. Different people will hit this kind of peak at different time periods, and for some people it's super young. Some people they can push it much further on. And a lot of this is down to mindset, and that's kind of one of the big things that I'll be talking about. So, in the kind of senior stage, the big thing that people point out is just the fact that, their faculties are declining. So, physically, everything's getting worse. Mentally, cognitively, everything's getting worse. And there's probably still like a resources thing because, this is when people might be starting to have families, have kids, have jobs with like higher levels of responsibility. So like the resources thing never really goes away for a lot of people, but actually by the time you get to this stage, hopefully you found ways to optimize a lot of that and make it at least a little bit more efficient. Obviously that might go out the window if you start having children or something that you haven't experienced before. Then you've got to go through another process of that. But yeah, resources can be quite a big element of it. But the real thing that you'll really start to hear at this stage is just a general feeling that physically we're starting to be on the way out, and that's I'm speaking of that from the sport rather than on the way out of life. Depending on the kind of conversations that you have with people, sometimes it's hard to discern the difference. And this one's always been really weird to me, like how readily people are up for kind of accepting that once they hit like a pitfall later on in their kind of sports career, that's just it. Like they can't expect any more progress beyond this point. When before you hit those same kind of pitfalls and you just see this as something like, I guess I just got to get better. Um, it's always kind of confused me a little bit as to why aging seems to be like the number one perspective. And I think I alluded to it earlier that for some people, I actually think it's a bit of an excuse. So habit change is really hard to affect either way. So sometimes, if I'm going to my cubing competitions and I go in every single week, every single month, and I've done that for, a couple of years, you start to get into the habit of it. And it's very difficult to break that. So, you know, you get older and older, and eventually you're probably going like, all right, well, none of my friends are still going to competitions. I don't want to feel so left out from like the journey of life that I'm on, and I want to kind of still feel like I can connect with all the other people in my life. And eventually that's going to mean moving on from the things that I used to do in the past and moving towards new things in the future. And I think for a lot of people, suddenly running into like a plateau is a really convenient excuse to be like, look, I guess I'm just getting old. I guess I've just had my time. I'm not getting the results anymore, so I'm just going to pack it in. And as I said way back at the start, I think it's not bad to say that. It's not bad to have something that you love doing come to its kind of inevitable conclusion. But I personally don't think that we need to attach that kind of sad note to everything. I don't think that we need to finish things on, oh yeah, I got as good as I could possibly get, and then it all went downhill, so that was the sign to stop. Why not acknowledge the fact that you probably could have pushed back, like if you wanted to, if this was the only thing that you wanted in your life, you could have gone back, pushed against that, and come out the other side. And it just happens to be that that's not necessarily what you wanted to do. By equal measure, when you were younger and you were good at something, you probably could have been way better at it if you had done more work. And maybe it's just because we kind of condition ourselves to think like there's no point in doing something unless you're going to give it your all, you're going to give it 100%, you get as good as you possibly can. In reality, that's a pretty horrible life. The people who push themselves to be the absolute number one in their sport, they can get there, but they're not necessarily always doing very well with the rest of their life. Top sports people tend to see all of their social relationships go down the toilet as they get older. A lot of the people that I see, training, the ones who want to be at the very best, usually, the only friends that they got are within that kind of sport and within that culture, and they kind of struggle to interact with people on the outside. Same goes for pretty much any other aspect of life, like finances and things like that. When it comes to like top athletes, they're getting all these finance, like sponsorship deals and stuff that really should be sitting them in a much better position when they come out, but because their sole focus is on being number one, then they actually don't take the time to learn the additional skills that they need to make sure that they're in a financially healthy position by the time they come out. And again, that's totally fine to do. You can do whatever you want with your life, but I think it leads to people being too hard on themselves or wanting to fall back on excuses for not pushing themselves to their very limits at all times. And so when you're in the middle of your kind of sporting career, it's like, yeah, you hit a plateau, but the ceiling was way higher if you wanted it. The problem was you just didn't want it, and you didn't have to want it. That's totally okay. And when you're older, the same thing. Like, you're not failing because you're getting old. You're failing because you're losing interest and you want to move on. And that's also totally fine as well. Sorry, bit of a rant about that, but I think it is important for people to think about that as well, because when you do move on, are you moving on relegating yourself to like a life of now just perpetual decline, or are you going to move on to something where you can grow and learn and accomplish big things again? If you take one version of that approach, if you say that everything's declining, I kind of reached my peak and now I'm kind of done for, in some sense, that means some aspect of your personality or your physical abilities is currently spent. Like, there's no more in the tank and there's no more coming. And that's really not true at all, especially, what we consider senior cubers to be like 40 years old. You got a whole another lifetime to go out and achieve things, and they can be, social things, sporting things, within whatever realm that you want it to be. I think I'll tell a story of the probably most impressive physical kind of feat of a person that I got to meet. I was training in a gymnastics club. Can't remember how long ago, a little bit before COVID, and myself and my flatmate training with this guy who was just kind of doing a couple of, I don't even know if I saw him train anything. I think I saw him do a few pull-ups, and that was about it. And then he was just sort of hanging out, chatting to everybody. Kind of older guy, seemed like very kind of laddish, like just seemed like he was only there to just chat about how much he loved training and working out and stuff. But I didn't really see him do anything at the time. And we got to train back with him, and he was just kind of going on saying, oh, I'm 67. I can't train in most other gymnastics clubs because their insurance won't let me. They say I'm too old. And I don't even care if I do like super high level gymnastics. I just really love training and I love all my old school kind of fitness, like press ups and pull ups and all of this. And I kind of didn't know what to think about it. Wasn't sure whether I really believed it because I hadn't seen him do very much while we were there. And then he starts bringing up, oh, I've got all these world records. I broke all these world records for doing the most pull-ups in an hour or something like that, or maybe most pull-ups in 24 hours. I can't remember. But yeah, he started telling me about all these world records he had in press-ups and pull-ups, and then at this point, I'm just going, yeah, there's no way, man. Like, sorry to judge a book by its cover, but I guess I did judge based on the fact that I saw him in the gym not doing very much work. And so then he pulls out his phone and he shows me his kind of hallway, and it's just covered in Guinness World Record certificates. Is like he's got a bunch of them framed, and it's the proper certificate in a frame. And then there's a point where you just realize like he's got so many that they don't fit in this room anymore, and so then just all these certificates are just scattered around. Some of them like on the kind of drawers, and some of them are just like now on the floor at this point. And it's going like, oh man, who is this guy? Turns out it's a guy called Stephen Highland, and yeah, legit started breaking world records in his 50s. I think had a bunch in his 60s as well, mostly for like press ups and pull ups. And you can find him, you can follow his Instagram. He's just doing backflips and all sorts, just well into his old age. And I even think if anyone's a fan of David Goggins, the kind of mindset guy, the one always trying to push himself to his limits, he has a chapter in his book that's just all about trying to beat this guy's Stephen Highland's world record. But yeah, that guy was inspiring for sure. And for me, it was like one of those clear examples of when, don't know how to put it, like you're definitely going to see all of your cognitive faculties, your physical faculties, everything as you get older is going to get worse. But the degree by which it is going to get worse, we massively overestimate. What you think is just you aging is actually your brain not pushing itself enough to keep certain skills intact. Like your brain really likes conserving energy. So one of the ways it does that is to lower your motivation and to make it feel like things that you used to be quite happy and energetic to get up and do just aren't worth getting up and doing anymore. And if you don't exert all of this energy all the time, then your brain doesn't have to use up so much energy learning new skills and trying new things. And the result is, because you're not using it, the same as we talked about with the kind of pruning and the brain cell connections early in life, when you stop using things, you start to lose them. And so over time, these abilities that you had start to decline, and you attribute it to age, but actually your brain was perfectly capable of keeping those things going. It's just that you didn't. I don't know what I want the main message of this to be. I guess it's more a call for like honesty about these things than it is to like chastise somebody for not still cubing when they're older, or for not kind of pushing themselves, because I think that's pretty overrated anyway. Like, you can be the next Felix, but until the Netflix documentary came out, like how many people in the world that was that important to. You can watch the movie Whiplash. I think it sums it up pretty well. It's like you can aspire to be the greatest in the world, but at the end of the day, nobody really cares that much. Like if you're going to do it, you do it for you. You don't do it for anyone else. And if you're going to quit it, if you're going to give it up, if you're going to slow down because that's what you want to do, not because you've either self-imposed failure on yourself and said, yeah, I just can't do it anymore, or that you genuinely believe that you just can't do it anymore. It's most likely not true. So that brought it right full circle to me at the end of this competition. Yeah, genuinely felt the kind of pressure of time when I saw myself kind of like drop down the ranks for a second year in a row at the Irish Championships. And all of those kind of same thoughts of like, yeah, maybe this is just your time up, kind of popped into my head. And I kind of ran through that podcast almost through like my own little self-talk and got to the point where I was like, yeah, hang on a minute. I don't think I'm done. I think I've still got quite a bit more that I can do, that I can get through. And I think honesty is actually a big factor in it. You know, when I went into this competition, I've changed my cubing strategies so much for trying to get the results that I want to get. And there's been like a big play on trying to manage learning new strategies. So I still haven't optimized, all my three style valves and stuff like that. So I'm trying to optimize all that, get them faster. But at the same time, I need to be training consistency at the same time. And I've been running through like different methods, different things to try and do that. And some of them seem like they're working well, and some of them not so much. And yeah, that's what I'm going to take away from this competition is that just because I think something is working for me because everybody else says it should work, or scientifically I know that it should work, the results are always going to speak for themselves. And I need to take a step back and kind of think like what things are actually going right for me, what things are not. Honestly, if I was to give an answer for that right now, I don't think my training is an issue at all. I think my mood, my mindset, every time I go into competition is always slightly off. And I actually think just sorting that out should be enough to make big changes and get better results. And that's what I want to look at going forward. As for like physical capacity and stuff like that, I honestly can't say that I said I was feeling old, I actually can't say that physically I feel like that's the case. I think all the things I'm doing just seem to get faster and faster at all times. And yeah, I guess that's a positive note for it. So looks like we're getting to the end of this one. Like I said, thanks for the wait. I'll be back with more videos from next week onwards. Just got a few more things to load into the studio. Got to get a table so I can get more practice and things like that done. But otherwise, I appreciate you watching, especially if you've watched it this far. And I'll see you next time.